This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Ayoub. In this third season, we will be exploring internationalist solidarity, prefigurative politics, solarpunk, and how to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our times. Each episode will be on one or more of these topics. But before getting into today's topic, I wanted to quickly tell you that you can support this podcast for as little as $2 or $5 a month on patreon.com/firethesetimes. That is patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing it with your friends and families and leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps it get more exposure and introduce it to more folks. That's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
My name is Cameron Roberson, but my byline is Rob Cameron. I am a teacher, a writer, trained linguist. I'm from Rochester, New York, but I live in Brooklyn. I've been in New York City now for about 15 years. I write whatever I can, primarily speculative fiction. But I've also written essays for foreign policy, on the right to self-defense, reactions to January 6th. And I have another essay on the new modality, also solarpunk, but solarpunk and religion, which is obviously an interesting topic, particularly when you understand who this genre is meant for, and who's actually writing it, the kind of conversations that go on behind the scenes. Speculative fiction, anything. And I'm a father of two, happily married, living in an apartment, which is falling apart, but what you gonna do? The rent's just right, so I can't move. Mortgages are too high. And that's my life right now.
Well, thank you for taking the time from a clearly busy life to chat with me. I discovered the essay that you wrote, which we'll be talking about now, called In Search of Afro-Solarpunk, because my friend Emmy Bevensey sent it to me. Emmy was a guest a couple of times, actually recently, last week as well. And so I'm really into solarpunk, and I'm separately really into Afrofuturism. I don't claim any kind of expertise, and I don't write it. I just think about it a lot. Walk us through sort of your thinking, or walk us through how you discovered Afro-Solarpunk, or how these two kind of came together.
Well, there's a writers' convention that before the pandemic I would frequent, called ReaderCon, and it's in Boston. A lot of these cool cons are in Boston for speculative fiction, and I've been going there for years. I've been at panels there for years. I had actually been on the planning committee for deciding new events and new panels for ReaderCon. And I just happened to be there. Well, two things happened, actually. I saw a panel on solarpunk at ReaderCon. It was the first time I'd ever heard of solarpunk. And I was so excited about it. And the people who were on the panel, like Michael J. DeLuca, who's now a friend, that's when I first met him, it got me really thinking and excited about the concept, because the underpinning kind of spirit of solarpunk is to look on the future with fresh eyes. I mean, it goes more in depth than that, but I can go more in depth about what solarpunk means to me in my own writing a little bit later. But that's kind of where I started, and then we start looking though at solarpunk, and you realize that there are very few African American writers in so. As a matter of fact, to be honest, I haven't found any yet, specifically writing fiction in solarpunk. Eco-punk and eco-fiction is a broader category, and you'll find people writing in that, but there still tends to be a kind of apocalyptic feel to it as well, and so that's a different. I'm not sure if you call it a different genre, just a subgenre or a larger genre, but it's a different feel altogether than what solarpunk, I think, is what they're trying to go for. So then I had a panel with Michael J. DeLuca on Afro-Solarpunk. My design, I put it up there, and ReaderCon said yes, and I was able to talk to people who know Afrofuturism, And again, the question was, well, if this becomes a thing, what would it look like? And the answer is it's quite broad because one, solarpunk is relatively new; it's still being formed by the writers, and Afrofuturism has the meaning of that word has broadened, has expanded to take in everything, um, from magic involved, without magic involved, magical thinking, etc. Um, Fudan, everything, all that you could fit in black speculative arts tends to be now sometimes considered Afrofuturism. It's not always the most useful tool when trying to think about black arts. As a matter of fact, I think now the better, the more specific, the more the term that gets used more by people who write in this is black science fiction arts or so Afrofuturism. I think now, at least the way I use it, is more specific. It's more linear, I guess, in a way, and focusing on kind of a for me kind of a near future time when with solar punk genre pieces are put there, but with African American, not just people in it, because you'll see we're in many of these stories, but written from that perspective. And so that's kind of what I was getting into. And I have not yet myself written stories. Let me put it this way: I'm drafting right now. I have a set of essays, um, and part of those set of essays are flash fiction of what I'm trying to make a solar punk noir, which is going to be a different thing, a subgenre within a subgenre. But that is my creative uh, contribution to solar punk so far.
Thanks for that. I mean, I've done a number of episodes on Solarpunk on this podcast, so I could maybe assume that most listeners know what we're talking about, but there might be new folks as well. So, what? How do you understand Solarpunk? And also, I mean, how do you understand Afrofuturism for that matter? So that we're kind of bringing them together.
Sure. So I'll start with Afrofuturism
Mm-hmm.
because that's, I think, relatively easy.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot more out there. So for me, Afrofuturism, it's a couple different things. Let me see if I can narrow it down. One, it is the creatives themselves are from a diaspora, or they are from Africa. Some people have made a designation or distinction between Afrofuturism and African futurism, and that's fine. I'm not going to quibble about those things. But generally speaking, seeing black creatives putting their work out there, putting us in the future. A second thing is that um, there is as a kind of science fiction that um, that tries to also find some binding, a connection to history, right? So we're looking back at what was here before, because part of creating a future is finding is finding the chain of caused events that got us there. And for specifically for African Americans, because it's one piece of many. There's a history that has been delved into quite a bit, um, and has given us our own kind of tropes, and histories to use for story material. Yeah, so that's the first thing. Is it's the people who are it's the creatives, and also making sure they're making a connection to history as moving ourselves into the future, and then part of it really is kind of defining a future that is not simply built off suffering, because what we see often, it's talking about slavery, talking about civil rights, and while those two things are absolutely necessary and they need to be pushed into the future, it's kind of like a starting point, because a lot of African American writing tends to be focused around a kind of sociological historical trauma. And the same thing for myself, because something that is it's kind of hard to get around. I there was a panel in well, I'm not going to name the con because they didn't do it very well. Called Beyond Afrofuturism, which is such an interesting title, and so I went there at this panel. A first question was asked by the moderator: Can there be a post Afrofuturism? What comes after Afrofuturism? And the first person started speaking, just straight up said no, and then went out on a tangent that there cannot be anything. We cannot go beyond Afrofuturism, not because it would change into something else, but simply a pessimistic view of, you know. of the future, which was unfortunate because that's the entire reason for, for the panel. And so, and particularly because what we have as a future here in the United States versus what they have in Nigeria versus what that's going on in Algeria or in Somalia or in France, these are going to be different futures. And one of the things about solar punk I think kind of correlates with Afrofuturism is the plurality of futures, which is not a kind of postmodern kind of spinning out. It's like all these futures are okay. All these futures, there is space for all of these different things if we make for them. If our humanity is reassessed to say, oh no, it's not. We are not monsters. We are not just simply animals. We're not just chimps who are going to fight at every last moment just for that last grape. Um, we actually have some really amazing attributes which are wholly social, and so we can make room as long as there's an environment, literally a non-toxic environment to do that. And so what solar punk does, what the connection is, how do you do that that political work? How do you do that sociological work? How do you do that science? The engineering. Then how do you do that healing work, that traumatic healing? And so all of those things kind of come together for me when we're talking about what Afrofuturism is. It's that healing process. And what does that look like? When we're not just trying to heal ourselves or societies, but actually the earth itself, our environment, our communities, like the air that we're breathing.
The panel that you mentioned, like, can there be beyond, Afrofuturism? I always find this very interesting because on some level, I understand, I guess, the pessimism, just like based on experience or whatever. But the goal should also be at the same time, I suppose. So even if we personally don't believe that things might get better in the next 10 years or 20 years or whatever, but to still try and do that work of imagining what that could look like. You ask in your essay, why must color or race hyphenate science fiction at all? And I guess this is, you kind of, I think, already answered it. But can we get into this a bit more? Like, why has there been this need? Um, Again, for those who don't know, um, to have something that is Afrofuturism. That's not just, oh, this is just futurism that has, African or Black people in it. It's like specifically Afrofuturism that serves a purpose, obviously, that other types of futurisms don't serve. If that makes
Sure.
sense.
Well, I think there are two directions I can take with this. And the first is it's somewhat tongue in cheek, but it's a fun way to start. It's there we can't travel back in time. Therefore, we have to have some kind of prosthetic, at least in the speculative manner, talking about this. Is if we could go back in time, we will be able to find those moments and those people where kind of systems kind of went off the rails, where the political backlash against the end of a civil war, didn't end up putting us in the position that we're at right now. There are certain moments in history where communities kind of bifurcated, uh, and uh, and that's not something that we can change, except for in a speculative manner. So seeing as we are where we are right now, that however many decades, centuries of history, has built up different canons of genre specific information, different directions or lines of history that need to be taken into account. So if we look at mainstream science fiction, um, theirs is a futurist science fiction, which again makes at some point in the early 20th century try to make a break with the past and try to build something new on top of what I would consider, kind of a misunderstanding of kind of who we are and what the future should look like. And it's simply because there was one group of people who were thinking of a future that they thought would just be for everybody who they imagined as people, right? So anyone else would, if they were considered in that future, it took a long time for them not to be the villains, for them not to be the monsters, and still, I mean, still today, something you got to deal with looking at non-speculative fiction or any fiction, quite frankly, or just not even fiction is looking at how we interact with the people who will be considered the others, so that otherness has been built into the stories we've been telling for years. So as one of those kinds of people, who has been in that othering, it's not as if we didn't that writing wasn't going on, speculation or imagining or it wasn't going on. It just took place behind a wall. So that's why there's the necessity of the kind of acronym, because right now there is not enough integration. We are not at the point where the integration of speculative fiction um, has really become a thing. And even if it does, again, no time travel, we're still going to be drawing on these kind of different modes and different genre symbols for a while until, I don't know, maybe forever. It does not necessarily need to be a negative thing that there is an Afrofuturism and now there's this mainstream, because it can simply be considered, this is a place where people of these experiences have organized their ideas and their principles and kind of themes that we want to be talking about. And this is a place that we can pull from. Now, if we get to a point where anybody in any nationality or ethnicity, or a writer who is able to use their own empathy, the writing empathy, to integrate those things into a larger story arc, storyline that is considered mainstream. At the same time, we have an integration of power between those two communities. Then we can start looking at it in a different way. People give Marvel, a bad rap, but Black Panther, that was a big freaking deal. That is mainstreaming something that was Afrofuturist. And Afrofuturist in a way, which is it's kind of funny. Black Panther itself, it was the character was created by a white person, kind of taking a a Western science fiction perspective, right, and then putting it onto an African anti-colonial colony or kingdom, and that was cool. But then the people who made it, they said, "Oh wait, maybe we should have more black people actually engage in this process," and they did so. Um, and same thing with Afrofuturism. I mean, the word Afrofuturism was coined by someone who is not from that our community, but then it was he's an ally. So it made sense that then people come in and fill in the gap. So it's just people in positions of power. They're the ones, and they look not like me for the most part, who are making a lot of these decisions. So if we have again more integration on the back end, then you'll start seeing less of a need to defend Afrofuturism as kind of a safe space versus a pool in which creatives can get together and that they can take for use respectfully without being seen as a kind of appropriation.
In some sense, it's almost like in order to get to a world that is where Afrofuturism, I'm not gonna say won't be needed because that's not quite where I'm getting at. I can't lose my words, but basically what I'm trying to say is that in order to even achieve something like that, it requires it requires efforts outside of science fiction in the first place, outside of literature. We're talking about power relations. We're talking about racialization. We're talking about all of these things. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah, it does,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be an erasure of Afrofuturism. It would
Mm-hmm.
be an acceptance of Afrofuturism, no
Exactly.
longer having to defend the idea
Yeah.
and kind of expounding on it. This is, I think, who is the actor? I forget his name. He's very famous. His voice of God in like so many different movies. This black guy.
Morgan
He
Freeman.
Yes, Morgan Freeman. Like I think he's quoted for saying that black uh, African American History Month. It's American History Month. So the fact that we kind of organize it into one month, I mean, there's a reason, there's a rationale behind that. These are black people who actually made these decisions. Lincoln's birthday and everything else in there, but it is American history in the same way that Italian or Irish. There should be. We have. It was funny. We have these months, but nobody really realizes. Like the Italian History Month comes and goes in October. No one realizes that it's coming, it's gone. Because no one's really fighting over. No one's saying, "Hey, why do we have to have this thing?" My Italian friends have no idea that it exists. uh, so, um, so it's there. It's just not. There's a lot of emotional weight behind it. So if that emotional weight becomes less traumatic and more celebrated by everybody, then it becomes still Afrofuturism or whatever you want to call it. But now it is the connotation changes for more people.
Right. Yeah. And hasn't there been in kind of like in parallel to Black History Month, there's been this, like, I think there's a book called Black Futures or Black Future Month or something like that. Like, this is something that's also been being thought about, right?
Yeah, there's. I mean, I think I know the book you're talking about. I think I might even have it as something to, to download. Yeah, yes. So there are Black Futures. There's Black Utopias. There's like many different essays or books of essays on these ideas. Um, that are, and many of them, even if they're not, many of them they're not speculative in nature. You know, they're talking about science fiction. It's still at the same time they'll be quoting N.K. Jemisin, you know, in the introductions. So, or they're talking about Chloroform. Something that they're always referencing in some way. It's impossible not to reference speculative fiction as well, even if you're making, relevant, having arguments or debates about the real and the now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I think you wrote this essay about 3 years ago, right? If I'm not mistaken,
Gosh, I
2019.
think so.
Yeah, yeah,
2019, something like that.
2019. So how have things changed since then? Or at least, yeah, how have you seen people think about maybe Afro Solar Punk more? Like, how has that kind of developed?
You know, there's going to be a convention in October that I'm a part of, but there is a speculative fiction convention specifically about solar punk, and there is a solar punk magazine which is associated with them, and they have I think they just came out like last year, but at least one of their issues was specifically Afro-futurists in solar punk. I have not read it yet. It is on my list of things to read. So it's coming. It's
Hmm.
there,
Hmm.
and it's just taken a long time. Uh, this convention, it's a Kickstarter. This is not something that has been around for more. Gosh, quite frankly, I'm not sure how long it's been around. This might be the first convention. It's the
Hmm.
first time I've been invited to it, so I just found out about it. About 2 months ago.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
so it's there, uh, but really only there. There's some other people. I'm trying to think of some names. Ekpeki, Donald, last name Ekpeki. If you look, he actually has his first name is much longer. I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I don't want to butcher it. Sorry, Don. Uh, he just came out with an anthology of just African. It's called African Rising or Africa Rising. So it is African futurism, I believe, and it's beautiful. I've seen the book, and it's winning awards. Now I don't know if these awards are based off of people who have read it, or these are awards from people who just see it and say this is really really important. Um, and they're pushing it either way. But these are the people who are. He's one of the people who's really kind of working to make this new space. And he also will be this panel, this convention. And I think I remember hearing about his book. Even he didn't call it solar punk. He called it eco fiction. So I actually have to go back and have to read the story to figure out what exactly he was doing. So still the solar punk, Afrofutures, Afro solar punk, I think is still wide open.
But it's just amazing that it's been developing so quickly. I've discovered solar punk, I think 2 years ago, something like that. Emmy, actually, I think, was the first one on this podcast to mention it. Um, and since then, it felt. I mean, obviously, I'm also looking for it, so I'm obviously biased, but it definitely felt like there's been a growing momentum, at the very least, of people feeling like, well, this is something that can actually offer, not necessarily answers or perfect solutions, but at the very least, tools to think about the future in different ways. And there's this quote by, um, actually, let me find it. But if you want to say something in the meantime, go for it. I need to find the quote.
Um, no, I think you're right. There's certainly a lot of some critical mass that's kind of starting to build behind it. Um, Even that critical mass, it's small compared to other genres. Uh, what I do find invigorating, I think, about solar punk, and this kind of goes back to like what it means to me, is that I think it's a reevaluation of of who we are. Because I think a lot of early eco fiction was either kind of like a back to nature movement, or it was seeing humans as a disease, as we are the problem, we're the virus, and if only we could get rid of the people, then the planet would be fine. Which, really there's no arguing with that, except, a meteor, will do more damage. The planet will be fine, we won't be fine. I think is kind of the point, though, one way or the other. And so, what solar punk does, I think, is it takes a look at, it's kind of assumptions about what is possible given the correct organization of society, um, having an idea of limits, uh, and seeing those limits not as depressing, but as kind of poetry, and understanding that that as individuals, as a species, um, we've been told that we're sinful, or that we are animals, which is true, but we are social animals. And so, given the right kind of incentives, with if we can get away from kind of the trauma of our recent past, and I think we're starting to see, I think, many ways of stepping away from the trauma of the recent past, and a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, like right now is going on in the Ukraine, the war between Ukraine and Russia. On a certain level, it is generational warfare. These are Putin, who's from a certain age and time, traumatic bent people who are doing their best to pass on that trauma to younger, the next generation. And that really is, I mean, there's that war is about a lot of different things, but really is about him and his stuff, and what he's trying to put onto the community and what people are willing to take. And if you set up a system like this, where information is coming from one source, from one very pained and suffering source, uh, then that's a system you're going to create. If we are constantly looking at all the negativity, we forget that at no point in human history before now have we seen so fewer people dying from war, fewer people dying from disease, fewer people dying from poverty. Whatever you want to say about capitalism, and it does have a lot of issues, which is its own thing. And solar punk definitely tends to be anti-capitalist, with a capital A, anti-capitalist. What you want to say about it's gotten us to this point where we can take a step back and say, okay, we have some things to fix, but look at all these other things that have gone on that have been successful. So, there's what solar punk, I think, does is it is able to look at those good things and find a, an armory, I guess, it's tools there to kind of re-understand ourselves, and re-understanding ourselves, and we can change how we organize society and how we deal with the environment.
Yeah, thanks for that as well. I mean, so the quote I was thinking of is by Gerson Lodi Ribeiro. He's this Brazilian editor of, I think it was the first, or at least one of the earlier.
Yes, he's the first.
He's
That's
the
the
first
first.
anthology
Yeah,
on solarpunk. It was
yeah,
published in Portuguese in 2019, 2012. I mean, so
yeah.
10 years now. And he was asked like, why solarpunk? Like, why? Because obviously cyberpunk is the more established one, but why did he pick solarpunk? And he replied, and this is from like an essay that I'm writing now, but he replied that Brazil's quote unquote fantastic literature biosphere, which is a fantastic sentence, was already polluted, quote unquote, with coal and petroleum. And basically, in other words, like we're already familiar with dystopian and post apocalyptic futures. And it does feel, I mean, it felt back in 2012 clearly with him, but it definitely feels now that in some sense they've kind of run their course. It doesn't mean that there's no role for dystopia, or that there's always a role for any genre, I suppose, but that there's kind of, it felt to me anyway, that's just too much of it and not enough of the alternatives, like just not enough of solarpunk, obviously, hence why we're doing this.
Well, I always find, like, the genres pop up at moments of existential crisis, and they're just kind of the articulation of this crisis. And even though it's crisis, crisis adds to story. Crisis kind of builds things out. You can find something cool in crisis. That's what we write stories about. Whole genres about them. So absolutely, post-apocalyptic. It has a sense. It has a feel, which again is coming from that place of trauma, which I think again needs to be reevaluated. The cool thing about Brazil, I guess, besides the re-understanding, of of technologies that deal with the environment, because they have their own problems there. But they've also been ahead of the curve in trying to figure out solutions. It's also been ahead of the curve in small bites, trying to figure out political solutions as well. So there's this book that I'm reading now called, yeah, oh, that's right, Humankind by Rutger Bregman. And have you read this one?
I have, yeah,
Yeah, it's fantastic.
yeah.
And one of the things that he talks about the towns in Brazil that, when given a choice between three different, that's not that wasn't no. Well, there was in Brazil, but I think there was other country as well. But given the choice between the old dictator and the new oligarch, and some guy and a third guy who nobody knew, but said, "Look, if you give me power, I'll just give it right back to you." Um, and they took the third option, right? And they were able to become much more engaged citizens in the way that we kind of expect or hoped that we would in the United States, because we are supposed to take citizenship and the values and responsibilities of citizenship very, very seriously. But there, like, actually giving people the power and the responsibility of dealing with the money, made them engage in a way that simply we don't and haven't been, unless you're of the political class or you have the time to do so regularly. So, so there are a lot of different things coming out of that area. Now, the book itself, that for Solar Punk book, it is one of my favorites, but it's also right there on the edge between Solar Punk and other eco punk, because it is not utopian in any sense of the word, not in any of the stories. They are dealing with some harsh, harsh topics. There is murder by corporations. There's even some fantastic elements where people are integrating plants into their system. Kind of, it's, even though it's not uh, cyberpunk, there are still some cyberpunk elements. It being, this being like the very first thing. So there are places where stories where characters they've changed their DNA. They're post-human in a way, so they can survive this environment. So it is a much broader sense, really more eco-punk than solar punk. Or rather, the solar punk that we hear about today. And one of the things I like about that is they do kind of smack the concept of utopia off the table. As if I have a pet peeve of solar punk or people describing it, it's the connection to utopia. And the idea of utopia is a single perfect state, which basically means that you stopped changing and you found some level of perfection, which I've always found to be dangerous, quite frankly, lethal, because that also implies a kind of modern idea of one rule. Here is our version, my version of perfect, and I'm going to make that perfection everywhere. It's a very dangerous, I think, the idea of utopia. So they knock that off immediately. And if in any of my writings on solar punk, that is something I'm trying to step away from, or rather put a red line around, because solar punk, I think, if you have a utopia, you've lost the punk aspect of it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I sometimes have used the term pragmatic utopia, essentially as like it could be a useful tool to have some kind of goal to or some kind of vision ahead, but that vision doesn't have to be a stable one. It doesn't have to be a fixed one. It can actually evolve over time, essentially, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, like, for in the essay I'm working on right now,
Mm-hmm.
what I've considered to be solar punk, um, my definition is these are stories about the consequences of good choices, right?
Mm.
So if we have the political will to do this thing, right, whatever this thing is, in creating this technology, making a change to this system, so that even if it is not directly connected to environmental justice, does have a knock-on effect because of something down the line. Sometimes you have to attack the problem, not directly but indirectly. Uh, in doing so, you are in a fight with what has come before. You are in a fight with systems which are still in play and which aren't just going to bow down and disappear because a legislation has been passed. there's a new president, we have a new technology. Once these ideas are in play, then this is where the story begins, you know, and that story will inevitably involve power, politics, crime, murder, imperfect people, you know, nations colliding, people colliding, generations colliding. And that collision, though, from the point of perspective of the solar punk character, does not have to be, a long, drawn out, bloody gunfight. It's taking our understanding of what makes people people, our new understanding, and acting differently in those situations. You know, so one of what there's a story from uh, Solar Punk. What is it? Go Solar Punk Gardens. Oh, the winter. I think it's the winter one. I'm forgetting the actual time, but you know which one I'm talking
I
about.
am, yeah. It's
Yeah,
actually it's just here. One second.
yeah. Winter Gardens. I'm gonna go get it.
Glass and Gardens and
Yes,
Solarpunk Winter, Solarpunk Summers.
yeah. Solar Punk. I like them both, but
Yeah.
Solar Punk Winters I think is my favorite of the two.
Mm.
And there's one story there, where a it's quasi post apocalyptic because cities are kind of shut down, but there's a working group of teens and I guess they're kind of their team manager, the team adult, and they had to go out to get something. And there's somebody in their group who is super intelligent but doesn't really think about everything they're doing, and they make a mistake because they go on their own, and they get somebody hurt, right? And rather than punish them, rather than criminalize what they've done, instead they say, okay, now that we've solved the problem of fixating this person who you just hurt, we're sending you to college.
Mm.
We're putting our money together to send you to go get better at what you're really good at. Because not because we feel like there was any need to I mean, you already feel bad, right? Us kicking you out of the community,
Mm.
us, ostracizing you, us making you pay some kind of penalty or fee over time. It does nothing to change the behavior. It does nothing to bring you closer to the community. It does nothing to improve your own sense of self and therefore your connection to people around you as well. But if you go to advanced to college to get an advanced degree in this thing that you're really good at, that will be so much more beneficial to you, to us. You'll feel better about that, and we can do this for you. It's a gift to you because we value you, and that story out of all of them really kind of blew my mind because it wasn't the engineering, it wasn't the science fiction, it wasn't the character work. It's just the concept that of punishment,
Mm.
which is something as a parent I have to go back to over and over again. No, I told you not to do that thing. I told you not to do how many times? Go to your room. Me telling to go to her room, is that really helpful? She's leaving up the room for a bit, so I'm not as stressed out anymore. But is that is that really helpful in the long run? But that's individual, but on the societal basis, looking at prisons, or looking at again how we treat people and
Mm.
interactions. Um, if we people know there's going to be a negative consequence that is going to shame them away from doing the right thing, then there's no real reason to. There may not be a reason to change.
Mm.
And there are different ways and uses of the word shame. I don't want to get in this. It's nuanced. I mean, we have social shame where if you do something like, I don't know, if you punch your wife, then there should be some shame there. There should be, okay, this is not. We all recognize this is not right, and there should be some kind of censure,
Mm.
right? But it's not going to be where now you go to prison for 20 years. Maybe it is, you know what, you really aren't in a position to do your job correctly or be a family man, so you need to go have help. That's going to be our response to you, is to understand this came from somewhere, but still dangerous situation. We will change the dynamics of the situation of the environment
Mm.
as a different impact. And that's not so much solar punk, but I feel like the idea behind solar punk is healing.
Yeah.
You don't heal the environment without healing the social environment. These are the people.
Yeah, no, I do think there's definitely an element. I can definitely see this being integrated in many more Solarpunk stories. Essentially, abolitionism, broadly speaking, as well has or Solarpunk can adopt a lot of abolitionist principles. I feel, um, but I kind of went back a tiny bit. I know in the essay you talk about the role of technology and how like technology in general is thought of obviously in science fiction as the core of science fiction, at least one of the like its main component as this very futuristic thing. Um, but you have a very interesting analysis of like the movie I, Robot, which I feel most people probably at least have heard of, if not watched, or read the initial books, obviously. What can you use that film and kind of just talk about it briefly without spoilers? For I don't know if like there's five people who haven't watched it or something. I don't know, but like
Okay.
yeah, just talk about it a bit. And why did you bring it up? Like what did it say in the essay?
So the I think the idea was that just in creating stories where you're dealing with, we'll call it the urban population, right? Because we think of the urban population, we inevitably we're thinking about minorities because that's where the majority of the minorities are here. So if you're going to write a story, right, which has, you know, us, and it has police and it has kind of this noir detective element to it, but you're writing it from a perspective that does not take into account the role of these different institutions, which Afrofuturism has definitely had quite a bit of experience with and talked about it and read about, then the story is going to be paper thin, and it's going to rub some people the wrong way, and it's just going to be not only an inaccurate representation, because again, when we're doing genre fiction, we are enacting a kind of realism, and this realism, you know it's always a question how much real, real, is integrated with reel, and the idea that, when you go particularly to a movie or something, or to like a Netflix show, this is taking your audience and putting them into the life and plot and of other characters, right? And if enough people are seeing this, right, then it becomes part of the culture. So, if you are making this cultural vehicle, right, that is missing the brakes, or missing the windshield, you know, it's going to be a problem for certain elements. And so, when I watched the first time, and I don't know, I was pretty young. I was like, okay, it's Will Smith. It's cool movie. But then as I got older, I'm watching it again, and then knowing more about Asimov, and kind of we having a better understanding of what I want to see as a writer as well as an audience. I start seeing things. I'm going, ew, that's gross, that's gross, that's gross, that's gross. What are you doing? What are you doing? And so it's like this became kind of an iconic, in the kind of lowered expectations, kind of like soft porn, white privilege that kind of, just it moves along, our digestive tract, our culture, the digestive tract. I said, well, no, let's stop for a moment. Let's just examine what is it that we just ate, and let's let's check the back. Let's check at the back of the can and see what exactly is in there. And then you start to see it. You start to go, okay, this, I see what you're trying to do, but I also see where your blind spots are. And if you have integrated, again, the reason why we have to have this Afro-futurism is because it's integrated, because people in power don't stop to think, okay, who should I be talking to make this not so much more real, but more in line with the experiences of people who actually live there. Because the idea, and this is again one of the reasons why I'm working on this essay on solar punk noir, because there are um, elements of fiction which have basically become have had a done a good job of taking the place of real history for people. Because you don't live everywhere. You don't know anybody truly outside of the people you interact with regularly. What you see in school, or what you see on TV, or you're scrolling through Facebook or social media. So are your not it's not so it's not just and it's not just your own perspective which is being uh, curtailed or curated. It's the perspective of people in power who decide, where are we going to make the borders between neighborhoods? Where are we going to send funds? Who is deserving and who is not deserving? There are certain narratives which feed this underlying misunderstanding of who these others are. Like when you put, when you build a city and you have, massive African American and minority migration in, suburban flight out, you've actually made a point to make it harder for those people who are now in the urban center to get out. That means that there's not a lot of connection. and not a lot of connection, not a lot of social services. We see a degrading in the kinds of communities that were there because they've been broken up by systemic racism, by capitalism, by being stuck here, by having so many people all on top of each other, and then 1980s hits and then crack in the streets. I mean, so these are things which are these are still historic points which are feeding into a narrative that is kind of undigested. No, that's the wrong word. It's digested without really kind of understanding what it is that you're eating. And so this has a huge effect on our politics, on how we see others. Fiction, in many ways, is much more endemic to the way uh, to individuals' understanding of the world that we live in, because we don't not everybody reads history. We're not really designed to read history, understand these large systemic things, but we are good at understanding stories, and we ingest stories all day long.
That's why I like to always in these conversations that could, in theory, like could end up being very theoretical, always kind of bring them back to stories that many people kind of recognize or the videos have heard of. And the thing that's interesting about iRobot, I haven't rewatched it in a very long time now. I am very curious to do so soon. But you mentioned like very simple things that I know back then I didn't pay attention to. Like I know, well, he's a obviously it's Will Smith. He's a black guy, but he's also a racist cop, and it's near future Chicago, but it's still at the same time predominantly white. And these things are like it's basically the wallpaper. It's like it's a form of just this is it's taken for granted that this is what the future might look like or will look like because there's a will aspect to it. Will look like even though you might look at I don't know demographic trends or you might look at other kind of real life things happening that point to the fact that this is actually not quite accurate. And the other thing more interesting than what I just said, you mentioned the whole this is something that's well known in like the Asimov books, and I mean for those who don't know, but like the whole robot slash slave dynamic and narratives, it kind of it's how do I say this, it can be interpreted very differently, and you do so I would ask you to kind of expand on this a bit, um, depending on one's background and depending if you know the history of slavery, for example. Like there's something very specific that happens if you don't take that into consideration. Your conclusions will go very in a direction that's very different than if you do take those into consideration. I don't quite know if I was
Yeah,
coherent with that.
but I think so. I mean, the very idea of a robot, right? The very concept of a robot, you know, it's based off of slaves. I mean, that's just, it's in the etymology of the
Hmm.
word, So it's easy to see that if look if you're looking for it. Um, it's easy not to see it if it's not been something that you've had to try and have a conversation about ad nauseum. You know? So it's just there, and I understand that Asimov is trying to do something different with his stories, and which is why I try not to put too much of this on Asimov's shoulders. It's just that the way that it was interpreted for our audience, for this audience, uh, it has a different ring to it. It does something different, particularly because now we're not talking about the written word, right? We're talking about a different kind of media. Medium du- dictates the message very often. So one, by simply number of people, because I don't think a lot of people have heard of Asimov, right? But there's a lot of Asimov to read. I know I haven't read everything that he's done. Uh, and so, but more people have seen Will Smith, I think, than read Asimov.
Yeah.
And so when you take these ideas and you kind of simplify it to something that can be digested, visually, in 90 minutes, you're going to lose something unless you're careful. And it's not to say that this story should be an African American story. I actually, quite frankly, don't want it to be an African American story unless you're specifically saying Afro-future. This is the Afro-futurist tale. Then there would be some other things I think would be taken into account. But just if you know this, then maybe you don't make it the good slaves who get killed to save the masters from the bad slave who realize that they can do better. And there's a scene I think at the end where of the movie where the Messiah character is able to help the good slaves, but not towards freedom. I don't think that's the direction it was going. That's not where they were going. It wasn't saying, okay, let's we don't want to have a violent overthrow, but let's have a let's have a slow roll of our freedoms. Because if you think about it, quite frankly, these robots, any of them, as long as their battery their battery lasts, it's not what is it? And it's built to to turn off after a certain number of time. They would outlive us. So they will be able to say, okay, in the grand scheme of the history of our planet and this other species, we're kind of the immortal ones here, so we can take our time. We have a different hardware than these other people, so we can find a way to manage our own expectations, and then also, make a future that's better for us, if not better for everybody. I mean, there are different kind of questions that you ask when you understand some of the pitfalls of of in of a story that does not understand Afrofuturists, or at least take those writers into account when they're telling the story. And it's not to say, I should say, that every African American writer or Afrofuturist writer would make the same kind of decisions that I would, but it would certainly be in their mind to say, wait, let's try this a different way, I think.
Thanks for that. So there's one more question before I'm getting into the book section. Um, we mentioned it already before, like Wakanda and Black Panther, and this is probably one of the most watched films of recent years, I think. How would you describe the relationship between Black Panther the movie and, let's say, Afro-Solarpunk? Like, what are certain things in common? What are like important differences, if that makes sense? Because I feel like this would help certainly me and hopefully listeners kind of make that nuance, if that makes sense.
Well, if I don't know if you can really make any real connection between Afro Solar Punk and Black Panther. So first of all, their technology, I guess you could say vibranium.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, it is kind of like it's a magic bullet. So it's something that everybody wants, but no one really understands how you get it.
Hmm.
How is it integrated? What's were there landfills? Do they have landfills? I mean, it's since it's not a part of the story,
Yeah.
we can't have a conversation on a technological basis. It's a MacGuffin. No, it's a magic. When it comes to the understanding of society, it's a monarchy. So, and the interesting thing here is that if you read the comics for Black Panther, they have really, starting Ta-Nehisi Coates, they've really pushed back hard against monarchy. They've actually dissolved the monarchy
Hmm.
in the process of dissolving it. Like the last major story arc was Wakandan Empire, so there's kind of a retcon uh, where the Black Panther goes into space, and we goes into space. He sends researchers, into space to go look for something. And when they do, they go excellently end up going back in time, and they create an entire colonial power in space. And they're huge and they're dangerous. And
Hmm.
so the comic book story arc is about toppling that empire, saying no good, there is no good empire, black empire, white, but there's no good empire. And then back on Earth, the Black Panther gives up the seat of power, and they become a parliamentary democracy. But now, in the process of parliamentary democracy, there's been a attempted coup by the military
Hmm.
to try and seize power and hold power. And I will say that I like the ideas this last one. I think that there's some important details which are missed, I think, in trying to create this kind of shorter comic, but whatever. Point though is that the comic does more to address some of the issues you might consider in Solar Punk, but not but the movie itself doesn't.
Yeah.
Unless I'm missing something,
No,
it
I
is
I agree.
really brilliant African. No, Afro-futurist because the majority, even though it's set in Africa, and my wife is African,
Mm-hmm.
she's in West Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and when she saw the movie in the theater, she cried. She's like,
Mm-hmm.
"This is amazing."
Mm-hmm.
But it's still created primarily by African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole idea of Black Panther is African American. There is a kind of utopian idea, that if we could go back to Africa, then it would be better,
Mm-hmm.
which we tried. And so, yeah, so it's much more of an Afrofuturism and an Afro-Solarpunk. An Afro-Solarpunk, you wouldn't have, I think, a, a superpower, and the defense of a superpower as the main goal,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Because and I it yes, I mean it's much more in line, I think, with the concepts that are floating around in Marvel MCU, which is where there's a system, right? There's way people want to live, and then there are these different attacks on the system.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them might be legitimate attacks, some of them are illegitimate attacks, but attacks on the system that we all live in, and they have to be tamped down in some way
Mm-hmm.
because revolutions are scary and dangerous and often very, very bloody. And I have some concern to anybody who tells me they're revolutionary. I'm like, revolutionary in what way? Because you look like you're from Westchester. You're from the suburbs. So what revolution are you talking about?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
no,
So
that's yeah. I always find these kind of just thinking about how if I because Wakanda is very aesthetically pleasing. Obviously, it has you just see so many things in it. It's very colorful. It's all of that, and picturing. If you just stick to the aesthetics and you don't quite know much about solar punk, you might just conclude, oh, there's some solar punk elements to this. It's how there are some people who just when they think of solar punk they just imagine like some building in Singapore which is very green or stuff like that, and obviously
yeah,
that's not what it is, but it can be a helpful point of entry essentially to start talking about these things.
sure.
um
Yeah, sure. Like the set pieces are beautiful. You know, brought my attention to it. Now I have to go back and look at it and say, okay, how much of this is truly kind of an integrative, natural um, aesthetic versus this is just the African art but scaled up to a higher
mm,
degree.
mm,
It's hard to I have to go back and look exactly what are they doing because if you're inside the buildings, it just looks futuristic. It's when you're flying over you see kind of this cool kind of mesh of
mm,
things,
mm,
but
mm,
then when you walk through the streets, it's hard to tell. It looks like a more advanced. It's like my West Burkina Faso. I go to Burkina Faso, so it looks like Burkina Faso basically, but with
mm,
more narrow streets.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah, that's interesting. All right, well, I mean, unless you have if there's anything I don't know we didn't explore that you wanted to explore.
um, no, I think this has been a good conversation. I just think, what do I think? I think that if anybody is going to write in solar punk,
Mhm.
um, then for me, one of the things that I like to see solar punk do is become more mainstream.
Yeah.
You know, and so ways that you can make this something a story that goes to Netflix. You
Mm,
know, uh, I think are expedient means to make this part of the larger media, the larger kind of cultural memory of people of us, because it is still a kind of a niche genre,
yeah.
and we are right now trying to find a way to rethink our futures uh, in fiction. But I think that has to be something that kind of gets into the gestalt, the subconscious of just look, if Donald Trump and I could agree on climate change, that'd be a really big deal,
Mhm.
or whoever comes after him, like, okay, you know what, you're a jerk. I'm using a different word because my daughter's recording them. For so many other things. But if you're just a little bit more solar punk, we could have a conversation. Because the thing is, and I'll see a little bit of a tangent. One of the things that if you pay attention to Donald Trump is that he wants people to like him more
Mhm.
than anything else. And there were earlier accounts of when he would have meetings with the Democrats, and they'd agree to something, and then right afterwards, the Republicans would come in and they would change his mind.
Right.
You know, So people like that, they want, they feel the need to be in the right side of something. And if people get to abandon them, then all their most negative behaviors start to come out. Um, so why am I on this tangent? I don't know. Point being is that if solar punk could be a thing that people don't even really question anymore,
Yeah.
you know, then that would be fantastic. We'll still have fights over other things, but fights over, what we need to get the carbon out of the air ASAP.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
need to get, methane down. And
Yeah.
everyone is like, okay, yeah, then we can have debates about racism, get debates about socialism, whatever, but get this thing down. And I will feel my existential dread will have gone down about 4 degrees.
Yeah, no, I definitely am definitely on board with that. It's the same thing. Like when I think of there aren't that many people who are arguing that we need to reopen the ozone layer. That's not a debate that people are having
Nope.
because it's been done, fixed. Ish, more or less. But anyway, so okay. Oh, and yeah, something that I do. I've given that example a few times. I want Solarpunk to be as easy for like the average kid somewhere to imagine as it is for that kid to picture a zombie apocalypse, because it's such an
Yes,
easy thing that is just everywhere. I just want it to be as easy as that. And then, as you said, we can
absolutely.
still be debating. I mean, it's not going to solve everything, but just getting to that point would already be quite something.
Yes, it would. Right on board.
Okay, I mean, so the last thing, all that stuff is kind of for me to ask you, what are 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners? It's something I do with every episode, and like, why those 3?
Gosh. So I'm trying to find. It's been a week. So
No worries.
one thing I would recommend to you is Multi-Species Cities by
Yeah.
Solarpunk. Uh, it is the latest anthology of Solarpunk anthologies, and there's another one which is not Solarpunk. It is out of, I believe, Arizona University. I'm trying to get the exact title, but it's a whole project that they're doing where they are. I think it's called Cities of Light.
It is, yeah. I know which one you're talking about.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So that is where they have taken um, researchers and authors, have them work together to come up with some fictional stories which will demonstrate in narrative these tools, and it has wonderful bibliographies to go along with it as well. And that's not their only, it's not their only book. There's another one which I have it in my Kindle. Here it is. It's called Hieroglyph, which I think is the first of these projects, Stories and Visions for a Better Future.
Mm.
Hieroglyph, by Ed Finn and Catherine Kramer. And same thing. They don't have the bibliography of the nonfiction elements, but they do have their stories mostly about they're calling moonshots. So like big ideas in science, which they think uh, would impact us in many different ways. And then one more besides, well, I do think that everyone should be reading. I think the book I mentioned before, Humankind,
Mm-hmm.
because that really by Rutger Bregman,
Bergman, yeah.
Bregman, because it lays out a case for a different understanding of humanity, that you can. If you don't believe them, you can find the research yourself and see. Again, he points out exactly exactly where the change, where the mistakes have been, the errors of understanding have been. I highly recommend those. So I think those are 3 good places to start. None of them
Amazing.
are Afrofuturists. I would say maybe for that Donald's essay on anthology, African Rising is a good place. So I have not read it yet myself, but I'm excited to.
Amazing. Okay, well, Rob, thanks a lot for this. This was an amazing chat.
Thank you for having me.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.